The night before the hanging came without mercy, settling over the town of Red Hollow like a burial shroud, and Jonah Creed, the most feared outlaw west of the Black Ridge, sat alone in the narrow cell beneath the gallows, his wrists free for the first time in years, his boots resting on dirt that smelled of iron and old rain, while the wind moved through the wooden beams above him with a sound like slow breathing, as if the gallows itself were alive and waiting. And for the first time since he was a boy, Jonah felt no need to run, no need to reach for a gun, no need to lie, because tomorrow his name would be spoken one last time and then belong only to dirt and memory, and that strange freedom loosened something inside his chest that had been knotted tight for decades. The lantern outside his cell flickered, throwing long shadows across the bars, and Jonah leaned back against the cold stone, eyes half closed, listening to the town sleep, remembering how many nights he had watched other towns from the hills, planning escapes, counting enemies, measuring lives by distance and darkness, yet tonight there was no plan, only a single truth pressing against his ribs, heavy as guilt and sharp as regret, a secret he had never spoken aloud, not to his gang, not to the women who had loved him briefly, not even to the man whose blood was said to stain his hands most deeply. And as the wind whispered again through the rope above, Jonah spoke, softly at first, not to a person but to the night itself, because the night had always been the only witness he trusted, and he said that the stories were wrong, all of them, every tale of cruelty and hunger for blood, every legend carved into wanted posters and tavern songs, because the worst thing he ever did was not what they would hang him for, and the truest thing he ever felt was not hatred but love, a love born long before he became an outlaw, back when his hands were clean and his name meant nothing to anyone, when he was just a ranch boy with dust on his boots and hope in his chest, living with his father on a strip of land the maps forgot, where a woman named Eliza Moreno once stopped with a broken wagon and eyes full of quiet strength, a woman who stayed for a season and taught him that gentleness could survive even in a hard world, a woman he promised to follow when the time was right, except the time never came, because men with guns came instead, wearing badges and false righteousness, and in one violent afternoon Jonah's father lay dead in the yard and Eliza was taken away in chains for a crime she did not commit, and Jonah, young and shaking, learned then what the world truly was, learned that justice was not blind but bought, learned that silence could be as deadly as any bullet, and that was the moment the legend of Jonah Creed was born, not from greed or rage, but from a vow whispered over fresh blood that he would never again beg a cruel world for mercy. The lantern hissed as oil burned low, and Jonah paused, breathing through the ache in his chest, remembering how he chased rumors of Eliza for years, how every train robbery and jailbreak was driven by the same quiet hope that one day he would find her alive, how every lawman he shot stood between him and a truth no one else cared to uncover, how the night he became truly infamous was the night he finally found her name carved into a prison ledger marked deceased, and how he screamed into the desert until his voice broke. Because the outlaw the world feared was nothing more than a man who had lost the only person who ever saw him whole. Outside, the rope creaked softly, and Jonah laughed under his breath, a dry sound filled with irony, because tomorrow they would hang him for murders he did commit and call it justice, never knowing that the one crime that mattered, the one secret that could unravel his legend, was that every violent step he took was fueled by love twisted into grief, that the gold he stole was never kept, only passed to widows and children in towns that would curse his name while sleeping safer because of him, that the blood on his hands weighed on him every night, but not as heavily as the memory of the life he might have lived if the world had been kinder, and as he spoke, his voice grew steadier, stronger, as if confession itself were stitching something back together inside him, and he admitted that he was tired, so deeply tired, not of living but of surviving, tired of being chased, tired of watching men die because of his shadow, tired of waking every morning knowing he could never outrun the past, and in that exhaustion there was peace, because tomorrow there would be no more running, no more legends, no more lies, only a body swinging in the dawn and a town pretending the world had been set right. The wind shifted, colder now, and Jonah lifted his gaze to the narrow window where a strip of stars cut through the darkness, and he wondered if Eliza could see the same sky wherever she rested, wondered if she would forgive him for becoming what he did, wondered if love counted for anything when it arrived wrapped in violence, and for the first time he allowed himself to cry, quietly, without shame, tears tracing lines through dust on his face, because no one was left to see him as weak, and in that solitude he whispered the final piece of his confession, the truth he had never written, never spoken, never allowed himself to fully accept, that he did not fear death, not the rope, not the drop, not the silence after, but he feared being remembered only as a monster, feared that the tenderness he once carried would be buried beneath gun smoke and lies, and so he spoke his story into the night with care, as if the wind might carry it beyond the gallows, beyond Red Hollow, beyond the reach of the law, to somewhere it could rest without judgment. And when his voice finally fell quiet, the cell felt different, lighter somehow, as if the walls had listened, as if the gallows above had paused in their hunger. And Jonah Creed leaned his head back, eyes closing, his confession complete, unaware that somewhere beyond the jailhouse, beyond the sleeping town, someone who knew the truth of Eliza Moreno still lived, and that his words, carried on the wind, were already beginning to stir a reckoning the Wild West had never faced before. They called her Isabel Crow, though no one in Red Mesa remembered the sound of her maiden name. And when she arrived at the edge of the desert town just as the sun was burning the horizon copper and gold, the men on the boardwalk fell silent in a way that had nothing to do with respect and everything to do with fear, because stories had arrived before she did, drifting in on dust and rumor, stories that said every outlaw who had ever loved her met a violent end, that bullets found their way to men who shared her bed, that graves followed her like a shadow, and Isabel herself never argued or denied any of it. She simply took the small adobe house at the edge of town, once owned by a miner long dead, and lived quietly, wearing black not as mourning but as armor, moving through Red Mesa with a calm grace that unsettled people more than anger ever could, her eyes dark and steady, holding something broken yet unbowed. And if anyone noticed how she sometimes paused at dusk to watch the empty road as if expecting a ghost, they said nothing, because Red Mesa was a town built on silence and survival, where people learned not to ask questions that might bring trouble to their door. Isabel earned her keep, mending clothes, selling herbs, tending a small garden that stubbornly bloomed despite the cruel sun, and at night she sat alone on her porch, listening to coyotes cry across the flats, remembering the men she had loved not as outlaws or killers but as human beings who once laughed, once dreamed, once believed they could outrun fate. And if there was guilt in her chest, it was tangled with sorrow so deep it had worn itself smooth over the years, until all that remained was a quiet ache and the certainty that love, when it came to her, came only to die. The town watched her from a distance, careful not to draw her attention, because misfortune had a way of noticing Isabel Crow, and no one wanted to be standing too close when it did. But fate, as it always does, paid no mind to superstition or fear, and one night, when the moon hung low and red over the desert like a wound in the sky, Isabel heard a sound outside her door that did not belong to the night, a rough breath, uneven and wet, followed by the dull thud of a body hitting earth, and she froze for only a moment, her heart tightening with a familiar dread, before she rose, lantern in hand, and opened the door to find a man collapsed at her threshold, blood darkening his shirt, his revolver fallen just out of reach, his face pale beneath a layer of dust. A stranger, though something about the way his jaw was set even in pain told her he was no innocent drifter. Isabel did not hesitate, because she never had when death came calling, and she dragged him inside with more strength than her slight frame suggested, bolting the door, laying him on her narrow bed, working with swift, practiced movements as she cleaned the wound in his side, ignoring the sting of memory as blood soaked into cloth, because she had done this before, too many times. And as the man drifted in and out of consciousness he murmured a name she did not recognize, cursed softly, apologized to no one in particular, and when his eyes finally focused on her face, something like surprise flickered there, followed by resignation, as if he had already accepted that this was where his luck ran out. "Don't waste your breath," Isabel told him quietly, her voice steady. "You're not dead yet," and he gave a faint, humorless smile before slipping back into darkness, while outside the desert wind carried news faster than any rider, and by morning Red Mesa knew that the widow of Red Mesa had taken another gunslinger under her roof. His name, when he finally gave it days later, was Caleb Harlow, a man running from a past he did not bother to soften or excuse, wanted in 3 territories, wounded during a botched robbery that had left 2 men dead and him barely alive. And when Isabel listened, she felt no judgment rise in her chest, only a weary understanding, because the West was not kind to men like Caleb, or to women like her. And as she changed his bandages and fed him broth, their conversation stayed simple at first, trading fragments of history like offerings placed carefully on a table between them, never speaking of love, never speaking of the future, both of them too scarred to pretend hope was a safe thing. Yet something began to grow in the quiet moments, in the way Caleb watched her hands as she worked, not with desire but with reverence, as if her calm were something rare and precious, in the way Isabel lingered a little longer each evening, listening to his low voice tell stories of rivers crossed at night, of mistakes made in anger, of a life that had narrowed until survival was the only remaining goal, and with each shared silence, each exchanged look, the desert heat seemed to press them closer together, weaving threads neither of them named but both of them felt tightening around their hearts. The town noticed the change too, the way Caleb healed and did not leave, the way Isabel's door remained closed at night, and whispers grew sharper, darker, because fear loves company, and men began to place bets not on whether Caleb would die, but on how. And though Isabel heard the rumors when she went to market, she carried herself the same as always, refusing to let superstition dictate her choices, even as a familiar dread curled in her stomach, because she had felt this before, this fragile happiness blooming in dangerous soil, and she knew how it usually ended. One evening, as the sun bled into the sand and the air shimmered with heat, Caleb stood on the porch beside her, stronger now, though the wound still pulled at him, and he spoke the truth neither of them had voiced, saying quietly that he should leave, that men like him did not bring peace, only graves, and Isabel closed her eyes, breathing in the desert air heavy with sage and dust, because she knew he was right, knew that loving him would mean inviting the same ending she had buried more than once. Yet when she looked at him, really looked, she saw not an outlaw but a man standing at the edge of something he did not believe he deserved, and she realized that the tragedy of her life was not that the men she loved died, but that she had survived them all, left behind to carry the weight alone. And with that realization came a choice that felt as sharp as a blade, and Isabel told him he could stay until he was ready to ride, no promises, no illusions, just the truth of the moment, and Caleb nodded, gratitude and longing warring in his eyes, because even a borrowed peace was better than none. Their love, when it finally surfaced, did so quietly, in shared glances that lingered too long, in hands brushing by accident and not pulling away, in the unspoken understanding that whatever this was, it was already doomed by the world they lived in, yet that knowledge only deepened it, making every moment feel precious and fragile, like water cupped in the hands under a merciless sun. And when Caleb finally kissed her, it was not with hunger but with restraint, a question rather than a claim, and Isabel answered with a softness that carried all her grief and hope together, knowing even as she did that fate was watching, patient and cruel. Trouble arrived soon after, as it always did, in the form of men riding into Red Mesa with hard eyes and official badges, asking questions that turned heads toward Isabel's house, and as the town braced itself for violence, Isabel stood in her doorway that night, listening to the wind whisper through the desert, feeling the old fear return, heavier now because she had something to lose again, and when Caleb stepped beside her, his hand brushing hers, she knew with aching clarity that love had found her once more beneath the burning western sun, and whether it would save them or destroy them was a truth the desert had not yet decided. Deadwood Crossing was a town that had forgotten what law looked like, its streets worn thin by boot heels and blood, its buildings leaning inward as if listening for trouble, and when Ethan Cole rode in just before dusk, dust clinging to his coat and a tarnished marshal's badge pinned beneath it like a wound that never healed, no one cheered and no one ran for cover, because Deadwood Crossing had learned long ago that salvation rarely arrived on horseback and almost never stayed, and Ethan felt the weight of that truth in his bones as he dismounted slowly, favoring the old injury in his leg that throbbed with every step, a reminder of the last town he had failed, the last badge he had sworn never to wear again. He had not come looking for justice or redemption, not at first, only for water and a place to rest before continuing on to nowhere in particular. But the moment he stepped onto the boardwalk and saw the fear in the shopkeeper's eyes, the way conversations died at his approach, the way men instinctively checked their weapons, he knew Deadwood Crossing was balanced on the edge of something violent, something inevitable, because towns like this always were, ruled not by law but by whoever carried the biggest gun and the least conscience, and here that man was Harlan Voss, a former cattle baron turned tyrant who controlled the crossing through hired guns and quiet threats, a man whose name was spoken carefully and never above a whisper. Ethan felt the past stir inside him then, memories clawing their way up from places he had buried deep, memories of another town, another stand, another day when he had been younger, stronger, and certain that doing the right thing would be enough, a day that ended with smoke, screams, and the bodies of people who had trusted him lying in the street, including his younger brother, killed because Ethan had believed the law would back him, because he had believed evil would hesitate when faced with a badge, and the memory tightened his chest as he pushed open the doors of the saloon, where the air smelled of whiskey and resignation, and every eye turned toward him at once. The bartender stiffened when he saw the badge, not with relief but with worry, because law brought consequences, and consequences brought blood, and Ethan ordered water instead of whiskey. his voice low and steady, scanning the room out of habit, noting exits, weapons, faces that had learned how to survive without hope, and he felt the familiar pull, the quiet calling that had ruined his life once already, the sense that if he walked away now, more people would die, and if he stayed, he might join them, but the choice, he knew, had never really been his, because the badge had a way of finding him no matter how far he ran. Trouble announced itself soon enough, as it always did, when a young man burst into the saloon bleeding from the head, shouting that Voss's men had dragged his father from their home for refusing to sell land, and the room fell into heavy silence. Eyes shifting toward Ethan, not with expectation but with something like a test, and Ethan closed his eyes briefly, feeling the old anger rise, sharp and bitter, because this was how it always started, with one injustice that no one dared answer, and he heard himself speak before he could stop it, telling the boy to sit, telling the bartender to fetch cloth, telling the room that no one deserved to be taken in the night by men who mistook power for right. The words hung in the air, fragile and dangerous, and Ethan knew then that he had crossed a line he could not step back from, because law was not just a badge, it was a challenge, and Deadwood Crossing had not seen one in years. By morning, word had spread that a marshal had come to town, a real one, not one of Voss's paid enforcers, and with it came fear and fragile hope in equal measure, because people wanted change but feared the cost, and when Ethan walked the streets that day, his limp more pronounced under the rising heat, men stepped aside, women watched from doorways, and children stared at him with wide eyes, and each look carved a little deeper into his resolve, because he remembered other children, other eyes, and how he had failed them once before. Voss sent his message that afternoon, not in words but in violence, when one of Ethan's few allies was beaten in the street and left alive only as a warning, and Ethan stood over the broken man as the crowd scattered, feeling the familiar surge of guilt and fury. Because this too was his fault now, and that night, as he sat alone in the room above the saloon, cleaning his revolver with hands that shook not from fear but from memory, he finally admitted the truth he had been avoiding since he rode into town, that he was afraid not of dying, but of surviving another failure, of watching another town burn because he believed he could hold the line alone. The ghosts came easily in the dark, his brother's face foremost among them, accusing and forgiving all at once, and Ethan spoke to him softly, promising nothing except that this time he would not stand down, that this time he would see it through no matter the cost, because running had not saved him, and hiding had not healed him, and if he was to die with the badge on his chest, it would be facing the men who had turned Deadwood Crossing into a graveyard of hope. The town began to choose sides then, quietly and imperfectly, as towns always did, a shopkeeper slipping Ethan information, a rancher offering horses, a widow bringing food and asking nothing in return, small acts of courage building beneath the surface while Voss gathered his men and prepared to crush the challenge before it could take root, and as the tension tightened like a drawn wire, Ethan felt something he had not felt in years stir inside him, not confidence, not certainty, but purpose, raw and unpolished, forged from regret and stubborn resolve. And when he pinned the badge openly on his coat the next morning and walked to the center of Deadwood Crossing to post his authority, he did so knowing it was a declaration of war, knowing that the past he had tried to outrun was riding hard behind him, knowing that by nightfall the streets might run red, yet also knowing that if he turned away now, he would already be dead inside. The wind swept through the crossing, carrying dust and the scent of coming violence, and as Ethan Cole stood alone beneath the sun, broken but unbowed, the town watched, the guns waited, and the ghosts of his past gathered close, because Deadwood Crossing was about to learn whether one weary marshal, haunted by failure and driven by stubborn honor, could still draw a line strong enough to hold against the darkness, or whether the West would claim him like it had claimed so many others before. Black Canyon was a wound carved into the earth, a place where the sun seemed to hesitate and shadows gathered long before nightfall, and everyone who lived within 100 miles knew its stories even if they pretended not to believe them. Stories of a gold vein so rich it could turn beggars into kings and kings into corpses, a vein said to be cursed by the devil himself, guarded not by men but by something older and far less forgiving. And when Samuel Pike first unfolded the map with shaking hands in a back room of a trading post, he told himself he did not believe in curses, because belief was a luxury for men who were not starving. Samuel had once been a respectable prospector, married, hopeful, certain that hard work would be rewarded, until drought took his claim, sickness took his wife, and debt took everything else, leaving him with nothing but a mule, a pickaxe, and a heart hollowed out by loss. And when the map came into his possession, passed to him by a dying drunk who swore it was real and begged Samuel to burn it instead, Samuel felt fate finally turn its face toward him, because the map bore markings no ordinary hand would draw, lines that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking, ink darker than night, and words scrawled in a language that hurt his eyes to read, yet promised salvation to a man with nothing left to lose. He set out at dawn, riding toward Black Canyon with the map pressed close to his chest, telling himself that gold was just gold, that men made their own demons, that whispers were only wind. But the desert grew quieter the closer he came, birds vanishing, insects falling silent, until even his mule began to balk, ears pinned back, refusing to go on. And it was then Samuel heard the first whisper, faint and distant, like a thought that did not belong to him, speaking his name with unsettling familiarity, promising that he would never be hungry again, that his wife's grave would have a proper stone, that all the suffering would finally mean something. And Samuel pressed on, because desperation is louder than fear, and hope, once wounded deeply enough, becomes reckless. The canyon opened before him like a mouth, its jagged walls swallowing light, and as he descended, the air grew cold despite the sun. Overhead, the shadows clinging unnaturally to the rock, and the whispers multiplied, overlapping voices murmuring secrets only Samuel knew, reminding him of his failures, his regrets, his quiet prayers shouted into empty nights. And though his hands trembled, he followed the map to a narrow cleft where the rock itself seemed to pulse, and there, glinting faintly, was gold, more than he had ever seen, veins running thick and bright through black stone. And Samuel fell to his knees laughing and crying all at once, because it was real, because fate had finally answered him, because the world had not been cruel without reason after all. He began to dig at once, fevered and frantic, ignoring the way the whispers grew sharper, more insistent, no longer promising but demanding, telling him the gold required payment, that nothing of such value came free. And when Samuel struck the rock too hard and cut his hand, blood spilling onto the stone, the canyon seemed to breathe, the whispers sighing in satisfaction, and Samuel told himself it was nothing, just exhaustion, just imagination, because men who stopped to think in places like this never left. And so he worked until night fell, until the gold filled his satchel and his arms burned with effort. And when he finally collapsed beside a small fire, clutching his prize, the whispers changed again, taking on voices he recognized, his wife's among them, soft and pleading, asking why he had come here, why he had not let the past rest. And Samuel screamed into the dark for them to stop, but the canyon answered only with echo and laughter, low and cruel. And in the flickering firelight he saw shapes moving along the rock walls, not quite human, not quite shadow, watching him with patient hunger. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by dreams of men digging forever in darkness, their hands worn to bone, their eyes glowing with greed. And when Samuel woke before dawn, his fire cold and his mule gone, he felt panic claw his chest, because leaving Black Canyon on foot with a load of gold was folly, but staying felt worse, as if the canyon itself had noticed him fully now and would not be ignored. And as he staggered onward, following the map back toward the rim, the whispers returned louder than ever, telling him he could not leave, that the gold had chosen him, that he belonged to it now. And the canyon seemed to shift around him, paths narrowing, familiar turns leading back to the same cursed spot, until Samuel realized with dawning horror that the map no longer showed an exit, only the vein, only the heart of the canyon. As if escape had never been part of the bargain, exhaustion dragged at his limbs, and the weight of the gold felt heavier with every step, as if the earth itself were pulling him back. And when he finally collapsed against a rock face, breath ragged, he saw other markings carved into the stone, names scratched by desperate hands, dates ending abruptly, prayers etched so deeply they split the rock, and among them a symbol that matched the center of his map, a mark that burned his eyes to look at. And Samuel understood then that the gold was not cursed because it killed men, but because it fed on them, on their longing, their grief, their refusal to let go. And that Black Canyon was not guarded by the devil but was the devil, patient and eternal, waiting for men like him to come willingly. The whispers softened then, almost kind, telling Samuel he could rest, that he had worked enough, that the gold would keep him company. And in his delirium he saw his wife again, not as she had been at the end but as she was when they first met, smiling sadly. And he reached for her, sobbing apologies, promising he would come home. But the canyon answered by pulling him deeper, the ground crumbling beneath him. And as he slid back toward the vein, the gold spilling from his satchel and vanishing into the rock as if swallowed whole, Samuel's screams echoed once and were gone, absorbed by the canyon like so many before him. Days later, a traveler would find Samuel's mule wandering miles away, reins dragging, eyes wild, and the story would spread again, another name added to the legend, Another warning whispered in saloons and around campfires, and men would swear they heard voices on the wind when they passed near Black Canyon, voices that promised everything and demanded the one thing no desperate soul could afford to give. And deep within the canyon, where the light never fully reached, the devil's gold gleamed softly, waiting, patient as the desert itself, knowing there would always be another man with nothing left to lose.